Hi there, I'm Richard Denning and I've written this book, The Amber Treasure, Treachery in Dark Age Northumbria, and I'd like to read you the prologue. My uncle. My uncle stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the corpses of his men. They had died defending this narrow gully through hills which blocked the approach to the city of Eberarcum. The city lay to the east under a pall of smoke which arose from 100 burning houses. King Aila had taken the army there to capture it, but, mindful of reports of an enemy warband coming to lift the siege, had sent Cerdic and his company around the city to the west to intercept them. There are times when the fate of nations rests on just a few men. A mere 80 men had marched through the night to reach this sunken road. They planted their flag in the ditch so it streamed in the wind, revealing the image of a running wolf emblazoned upon it. Then they gathered about it and waited, but they did not have to wait long, for soon after dawn over 100 spearmen had come down the road, and needing to reach the city urgently had attacked at once. The narrow confines of the gully had funnelled the enemy and brought them onto the spears of Cerdic's men. The enemy had paid dearly for each step they took, bled heavily for each wound they inflicted, and 3 had died for each of their own men slain. But in the end it had not been enough. One by one Cerdic's companions had perished, and as the company dwindled it was pushed back down the lane. Time and again my uncle had rallied his men, and they had charged back into the fray, regained ground, and forced the enemy to retreat. But now, as the sun sank and the sky turned a crimson red, matching the blood-stained clay of the road beneath them, Cerdic's company were all dead. All dead, that is, apart from my uncle Cerdic and the grim-faced Deira. The pair stood on the road in front of their battle standard, Cerdic tall and fierce, with hair the colour of autumn leaves, which in the dying light seemed almost like flames. Deira, shorter, stocky and muscular, with black hair and bushy eyebrows. Cerdic thrust forward his great sword and pointed it at the enemy's shield wall. It was a magnificent weapon, forged from rods of twisted iron, overlaid with the strongest of steel, crossed by a bronze guard and finished with an elaborately patterned pommel. With it he now gestured at several enemy warriors, picking out, or so it seemed, his next victims. Strapped to his other arm was his own bright blue shield, which was dented and scuffed from 100 sword and axe blows. Deira had abandoned his, and now both hands grasped the shaft of a fearsome axe that had, already today, slain a score of foes. Together they glared down the lane and waited for the enemy to attack once more. There, in front of them, still many more than 100 enemy warriors remained, and they, having now reformed their shield wall, and seeing that only 2 foes were standing, came on again. Eberarcum lay just a mile beyond this lonely pair standing beside their flag, which now hung limp in the still evening air. If the warband could reach the city, they could swell the numbers of the beleaguered defenders, and the city might hold. If that happened, more of the Eberarcai tribesmen from the surrounding lands would come here. They would save Eberarcum, then the Angles and Saxons like Cerdic and Deira, who had risen up from their scattered villages and come here to capture the city, would be slain. Then there would be no English city, no English kingdom here north of the Humber, perhaps even no English race anywhere. All that was needed was to kill these 2 men and march on to Eberarcum. For Cerdic this was equally just as clear. All he had to do was plant his feet on the bloody soil and survive just a little longer. He glanced at Deira and smiled thinly at him. Deira just nodded back. Both men knew they would die here, it was just a matter of when. The Eberarcai advanced again, and despite the odds in their favour, Cerdic could see that their faces were pale and their eyes were flicking back and forth. They were nervous, cautious, some even terrified. They had seen their friends die and knew these 2 men were fearsome warriors, so they chose to come together in the security of wood and iron that a shield wall offered. Nonetheless, they finally reached Cerdic, and 3 spear points were thrust at him. My uncle stepped to his right, deflected 2 spears with his shield, and then slashed the other one aside with his blade, the heavy steel easily shattering the ash stave. Cynric, following up now, stepped inside the spears and smashed his shield against that of a young lad in front of him. The boy stared at my uncle, his mouth and eyes wide, gave a terrified cry, stepped away, but then tripped on his own spear and fell, knocking over the man behind. Cynric jumped into the breach and, shouting abuse, Grettir followed him up. Grettir swung the axe to his left and right, felt its edge cutting into bone and flesh, and with cries of agony 2 men fell. Ahead of him, Grettir could hear his lord roaring as he plunged his sword into 2 more men, and then, suddenly, Cynric was behind the enemy shield wall. He turned and cut down another youth, but other warriors now closed in, and Grettir lost sight of him. The last that Grettir saw of my uncle was him screaming in defiance as swords and spears lunged towards him. Then a shield boss thundered into Grettir's middle, and with a whoosh of air he was winded and tumbled out of the fight. He was knocked onto his back and lost his grip on the axe, which spun away. He rolled over, clawing at the ground, desperately trying to reach the weapon. Then, above him, there came a shadow, and he looked up to see a huge enemy chieftain standing astride him. The man was lifting his own blade up, getting ready to finish Grettir. Oddly though, it was not the sword that Grettir noticed, but the man's face. One eye had been hacked away, and an ugly bleeding gash ran from brow to cheek. Cynric had left his mark on his enemy, and now the man came to have revenge on Grettir. As he swung back his sword, there was a sudden buzzing noise, and an arrow sped over Grettir's head, striking the brute in the right arm. He gave a roar of pain, dropped the blade, and with one eye he glared over Grettir towards the city. Grettir bent his head round to look, and almost cried with relief as he saw the glorious sight of hundreds of Anglo warriors, English warriors, charging towards them up the lane. Cynric had done it. He had held the road and denied it to the Eberarchi, and now the city of Eberarchum had a new name, an English name, Eorforwic. The enemy fled, and after a final venomous glance towards Grettir, the one-eyed chieftain went with them. Grettir took a deep breath and then dragged himself to his feet. He staggered over to where he had last seen Cynric, and now he could feel the tears coming. For there, surrounded by the bodies of his foes, he found his lord lying dead in a pool of his own blood and pierced by 100 blades. His own sword was laid across his chest, although, whether this was the last homage to a noble warrior by his enemies, the whims of the gods, or just chance, Grettir could not tell. Gods, what happened here? Grettir turned at the voice, then bowed his head to his king, Aila, the king of Deira and now conqueror of Eorforwic, who stared at the carnage on the road. Sire, we did what you commanded. The Lord Cynric died bravely, as did every other man. Aila nodded and stood silently for several minutes, taking in the sacrifice that had won him a kingdom. He then glanced down at Cynric. Take his body and sword back to his family, and tell them I will see he is remembered. He deserves a song. Grettir also nodded, but then frowned. I'm afraid I could not write a song to do him justice, my lord. Ah, but I can, a new voice replied, and Grettir saw for the first time a strikingly handsome young man standing next to the king. I'm Lila the Bard, Lila the Storyteller, the man said. Grettir picked up Cynric's sword, cleaned it and handed it to Lila. I will take care of the body of my lord, and you can carry the sword, storyteller. For all good stories are about a sword. Well, that's the prologue. If you'd like to know more about the book, you can go to the website www.theambertreasure.com. There you can read the first 3 chapters of the book after the prologue. You can find out how to download an ebook version, and you can find out where you can buy the paperback itself. Thanks for listening.